Hey, what's up guys? This is Nash, and today I wanted to make a completely different kind of video. A very quick and comprehensive video showing you guys how to play the game of chess over the chessboard. I've seen a lot of videos out there that go into detail talking about how to play the game of chess, all the tactics and strategies that you need to use to win games, and that's all really important stuff. But I feel like for complete beginners, like how I was in the past, I never really came across a video showing me how to actually just get into a game of chess, especially over the chessboard, right? Like say you come across this empty chessboard that I have in front of me, how do you know what to do from here, right? And say you wanted to play a game with your friends in real life, how do you go about doing that? Well, I hope this video solves that. If you guys like this video, please feel free to give it a like, share, comment, subscribe, and all that good stuff. And with that out of the way, let's get started. So hopefully in this video, I'll try to make it as comprehensive as I can. And quick disclaimer, I'm no expert in chess, but I have a decent working knowledge of how the game's played. I'll try to go over how to arrange the pieces on the chessboard, how the pieces move, the value of these individual pieces, i.e. the points, right? And you don't need to go into too much detail with points or, be concerned about all that if you're playing over the board in real life because, it's just a way to keep track of how you're playing the game of chess. Then I'll go into attack, defense, and line of sight. I feel like those are critical concepts that every beginner needs to know. And finally, I'll end with the objective of how the game of chess, how to actually win a game of chess, and where to go from here, so that you guys can carry on with your chess journey. So let's get right into it. So this is a blank chessboard that I have in front of me, a very miniature one, that too. And it has 64 squares, okay? There are, this board is actually composed of light squares and dark squares. And if you'll notice, I don't know if the camera is actually picking this up, but each square has a coordinate, right? So these are the A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H files, right? These are known as files right here. And these horizontal rows are called ranks. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So how do you set up the chessboard? Well, the easiest way to do this is, say you don't have this lettering system or coordinate system marked out on your chessboard. The easiest thing you can do is orient the chessboard so that you have a light square at the bottom right hand corner of your board. That will indicate that you need to place the white pieces on these first two ranks, and the black pieces will go on these last two ranks, 7 and 8. Okay? So let's start arranging the pieces. The first thing you can do is start by putting the rooks, because they're the easiest pieces to put on the board. They go right at the end, right here. And these are sometimes called castles, but I like to call them the rooks because they're fancy. So you got the rooks on either side, right here. And then, right next to the rooks, you have the knights. And let me pick out the knights real quick. These pieces are called knights or horses. I've actually never heard the term horses until recently, so I've been always referring to these as knights. And they sound way cooler, by the way. That's just my opinion. So you got the knights on either end, right? Right next to the rooks. And you'll notice that they're very symmetrical, right? The entire chessboard is a symmetrical display of pieces. So once you got the knights down, the next two pieces that come on the chessboard are the bishops. These two bishops right here. You have a light squared bishop, right? Why do you call this a light squared bishop? Well, it moves on light squares only in a diagonal fashion. Similarly, you have the dark squared bishop right here, and it moves in on dark squares in the same way. And then finally, the D and E squares, or the middle two squares, are reserved for the queen and the king. The D square is where always the queen will reside. That's one way to know how to put the queen. The other way is the white queen will always be on the white square in the middle, right here. That's the way to remember it. And the same goes for the black queen. The black queen will go here, right in the middle, on a black square. And then once you got that, right next to the queen comes the king. And there you have it. You got one rank all filled up with pieces. Then right in front of those pieces are all these little tiny pieces called pawns. They line up directly in front of all these pieces. So let me go ahead and put those pieces on the board and show you how they line up. Just put all these pieces here. There we go. Bam. And there you have it. You got all the white pieces set up on the board. And all you got to do is mimic the same process over on the other side. So let's go ahead and quickly put that and set it up real quick. You don't have to follow the same order. You could, but since I've been doing this for a while, you know, it comes naturally to me on where the pieces should go. You'll gain that knowledge by practice. And of course, if you're playing online, this is already set up for you, so you don't have to worry about that, right? So there we go. Got the rooks. Remember what I said about the queen? Goes right in the middle here, in the center, on a black square. The black queen goes on the black square. You got the knights at the end. Right next to the rooks. You got the bishops on either side. And finally, you got the king. And bam, there you have it. The chessboard is completely lined up, ready to start the game. So how is the game played? Well, white always moves first. And usually, you would always start with a pawn move. You could start with a knight move, and I'll get into how the pieces move shortly. But white takes a turn, and then black follows and responds with another move. Then white moves, and then black moves. Of course, I'm just showing you a random move pattern. This is not an actual opening or anything. Not that I know of. And you take turns making moves. And that's how the game's played. And the goal is to, and I'll get into that later. But let's go into how the actual pieces move. So let's start with the pawn. The pawns can only move forward. That's the unique property of this piece. It cannot go back, unlike some of the other pieces. So pawns only move forward, and their objective is to go to the other side of the board where it can get promoted. The first move, and only the first move for the pawns, can be a double jump right here. So it's 2 square jump instead of a 1 square. Typically, pawns move 1 square at a time, right? But only on the very first move, you have the option on your turn to move this pawn 2 squares. Similarly, you could move the black pawn 2 squares also, any of those pawns, but only on the first move. Okay? Once for each of these pawns. Once you've actually completed this move set, say white didn't move here, white moved here, right? Then on the next turn, say white moved here, right? The next turn, black can choose to move this pawn. Even if they do, it can only move 1 square forward. So for black, this is the forward direction. For white, this is the forward direction. Okay? So basically the objective is to get to the other side of the board for the pawns, for the most part. And so that's how the pawns move. Next, let's look at how to move the knight, because why not? The knight's a very unique piece because it's the only piece in chess that can actually jump over its own piece. All of the other pieces cannot push a piece and occupy its spot. Okay, that's only when you're attacking an opponent's piece. So in this situation, the bishop, for example, is blocked by its own pawns. It can't move unless one of these pawns moves and gives it an open pathway to move, right? So it's blocked. But the knight, however, can jump over its own piece and land right in front of it in this example. So how the knight moves is it moves in an L shape. So it goes 1, 2, 3, or 1, 2, 3, or it can go backwards. Say the knight was here, it could go 1, 2, 3, it could go 1, 2, 3, and say the knight was here, it could go 1, 2, 3, back to where it started. So knight is very flexible that way, and it's a pretty tricky move pattern. And you'll gain, over time, you'll kind of know how to spot where the knight has to land by practice. So that's how the knight moves. The other piece is, say the pawn moved here, giving space for the bishop to move, right? The bishop can move diagonally and only diagonally. And in this case, since I told you this was the dark squared bishop, it only moves on dark squares. It can move one square up. It can move two squares up. It can go the entire length of the board if it wanted to on its turn. So remember I told you there was each player takes turns to move, right? So you have to decide whether you want to move the bishop 2 squares on your turn, if you wanted to move it, whatever, 1, 2, 3, 4 squares on your move, right? That's up to you. But you can't push this, like right now, the bishop can't go here unless the pawn has moved to give it space in this situation, okay? Same thing goes for the light squared bishop. Bam. Like that, okay? That's how the light squared bishop moves, forward and backward. And then comes the rooks. Rooks are pretty straightforward, just like the bishops. It can go vertically and horizontally, entire length of the board, or maybe just one square, whatever you get, whatever you want, whatever the situation calls for. So it's very powerful that way. The queen is basically a very powerful piece, actually one of the most powerful pieces on the board. Why? Because its moveset is combined of that of a knight and a bishop. It can go forwards, backwards, left, right, just like the rooks, right? And it can go on the diagonal. Say it landed on a dark square diagonal, then it can start moving in those diagonals on its turn. Say it was here, it'll start moving on its light squared diagonals, just like a light squared bishop could do. So it's mimicking the movements of both a rook and a bishop. Depending on which square it is, it could be the light squared bishop or the dark squared bishop. So it's a very powerful piece. You always want to make sure you're protecting the queen, in the sense that you don't want to just move it wherever and have it risk getting captured, because then you'll be at a severe disadvantage throughout the rest of the game. You have to know exactly what you're doing, right? It's really good to preserve this piece towards the end, because that's when it gets stronger and it can assist some of the other pieces to help you win the game. So I've talked about how the pieces move. Let's quickly talk about the points value, because I think I brought that up. The queen, like I said, most powerful piece. It's worth 9 points. The bishop and the knight, they're both worth 3 points. The rook's worth 5 points. The pawns are worth 1 point. And the king has no point value. And by the way, I forgot to talk about how the king moves. King moves just like a queen, right? It can move vertically, horizontally, but only one square at a time. Remember how the queen can either go one square at a time, or it can travel the entire length of the board, right? Just like the rooks and the bishops can do. But the king can only mimic that same movement pattern, right? So if it was here, it can go here, 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 or here, right? And only one square at a time. That's the key thing about the king. And you got to make sure you protect your king. So the other movement patterns that are pretty unique is, and I'll talk about that when I get to attack and defense. So I've talked about how to set up the chessboard, how the pieces move, what the point values are, right? And now let's go to attack, defense, and line of sight. This is the most critical aspect in the game of chess that every beginner needs to know. So what do I mean by line of sight? So say the enemy are yeah, let's say the pawn's right here, okay? And I'm making this up on the go. Say your queen, say this pawn wasn't here, whatever, right? And your queen is here. Its line of sight means it can see this pawn, right? And on its turn, if it wanted to, it could capture the pawn. This is known as capturing, where you take the enemy piece and you replace your piece with the enemy's piece. And by the way, when you're talking about captures, I just wanted to quickly mention, remember how I said the points value isn't really that important, when you're just starting out? The reason why it becomes important later on is you kind of have to have an idea of what you're actually doing when you're capturing pieces. Now, for example, if I had the queen here, right, and it saw the opposing pawn right here, it could easily take it, and you've easily gained a piece worth 1 point for your piece. That's 9 points, right? And let me talk about how the pawn attacks real quick while we're on this subject. The pawn can only attack diagonally. It moves only vertically across the length of the board, slowly and steadily. It moves up the board, right? But it can only attack diagonally, meaning if the queen was right in front of it, it can't push this piece or whatever. That doesn't work like that. And can't attack. It's not attacking the queen. It sees the queen, but it doesn't attack the queen. Or it does not see the queen because it doesn't attack the queen. If you see a piece, it means you can either attack the piece or you can defend the piece. That is what I wanted to make sure that you guys understood. So in this case, it really doesn't see the piece, even though it's right in front of it, right? Even though the queen is right in front of the pawn, it can't really see the piece. But if the queen was here, then yes, it does see the queen in the sense that, yes, it can go ahead and capture it in this next move. And what a blunder that is, because you've just lost your most valuable piece to a piece that's worth considerably less value. You gained 9 points from, a 1 point move. So you got to be careful about those kinds of things. So that's why I told you that the point system comes into play when you're actually making captures, because you kind of have to know if the capture you're about to make makes sense. And back to the theme of line of sight, if your pawns are in this fashion, right, diagonally, it means that this pawn is seeing this pawn in front of it, right? But it's not capturing it because it's the same, they're on the same team, right? So basically it's defending this pawn. So that's a key concept. This pawn is being defended by this pawn. This pawn is being defended by this pawn. And this pawn is being defended by this queen. Why? Because the queen can move, remember, diagonally. So it is technically defending this pawn. It's also defending this pawn. Okay? This pawn has a defense here. Now what about this pawn over here? If I move it just slightly up, it's completely undefended. Why? Remember, the bishops don't move forward, they move diagonally. It doesn't see this. Knights, in its opening move, for example, in this situation, can only move to this square right here. Remember that L formation? 1, 2, 3. It doesn't see this. Rook doesn't see this. Its neighboring friendly pawns don't see it. It's out on its own. It's undefended. And this means that if white has an opportunity, it can go ahead and capture this pawn. So say this pawn made it all the way here for some reason. You made a move where you actually just kept pushing the pawn. You didn't actually develop your pieces. And that's an important concept, developing your pieces. You want to make sure that all of your pieces have a chance to play the game of chess as much as possible. There'll be situations where there'll be pressure to react on the go. But you want to make sure you bring out all your pieces into the game, right? As much as you possibly can on your turn, wherever it makes sense. Okay, now you'll notice black has a pretty good development, but white is completely undeveloped. All its pieces are just there. I mean, this would obviously not be real because you would have probably moved, say, your pawns, you know what I mean? Or some other pieces, corresponding move set that you had to play when black was playing its moves. So in this case, back to this position right here. This pawn is completely undefended. Even after I moved all these pieces, I don't think it's defended. No, I don't think so. Yeah, so this is completely undefended. So on your next move, white can go ahead and take this piece and replace it with your piece. And that's known as a capture. So you have captured the enemy piece. So the goal of the game is not just capturing pieces, which can be fun, but the goal of the game, and coming back to that important point. So we've talked about how attack and defense works, right? So in this case, remember, this is being defended, but this pawn is attacking this bishop. This bishop is attacking this pawn as well. But say it was black's turn to move and it captured it for whatever reason. You wanted to capture it. Cool. You got a piece worth 1 point. But look, in the next move, white can move its own piece. And remember how the pawn's captured diagonally? There you go. You've captured the bishop. And you've won a pretty strong piece for your pawn. You've won a piece worth 3 points. It's off the board. It can't come back to play. So there you have it. That's how the pieces move. That's how attack and defense works and line of sight. And remember how I talked about the king? The king's movement pattern is pretty unique. Let's say the bishop was out. Let's say the knight was out. And you had a situation where the king and the rook see each other. That's the only time. And say you've not moved the king. You've not moved this rook. You can go ahead on your turn. Move the king 2 squares and move the rook over. This is a special move known as castling. And why do we do that? Well, otherwise, you would have had to move the king up, over, and to the last rank here, or to the first rank here, back to where it started. But remember, it took 3 moves. And in that time, black could have easily developed and could have started attacking your pieces. And you actually wanted to, so the reason why we're castling also is actually like a protective move, a defensive move, where you're actually protecting your king for the most part away from danger. Normally, remember how you had 3, pawns protecting it? So say you were in this position and you move your knight from here to here. On your next move, say black moved something, right? I don't know. And on your next move, remember how the knight and the rook have to see each other? So instead of moving 1 piece and then you're done, you can move 2 pieces over to your rook and move the corresponding rook over, and have it side by side next to the king. This is a pretty advanced move. It's called castling. And you can choose to do it whenever, as long as you haven't moved your king, as long as you haven't moved your rook, and it's your turn to move. And this is known as the king side castling. You can also do the same thing. Say the queen was out, say the bishop was out, say your knight was out, right? The king sees the rook. You can also castle this way. So again, move 2 squares to the left and move your rook over. That's how you castle over the board. And usually the computer will do it for you, so you don't have to worry about that. So basically, see how the king's protected almost? And it's got a nice pawn barrier. It's got the knight out here. You want to move your king here probably in the next move to keep it safe, right? So it's a pretty useful move to do if you have the opportunity. Now, the time when you can't castle is when you have the enemy piece. For example, say your queen was captured for some reason. That's a pretty bad move. And say this pawn wasn't here. You captured their pawn as well, or the enemy captured your pawn as well. Say you're playing white. Look how the queen has a direct line of sight, right, to the area where you're castling. You can't castle. I think the computer will prevent you from doing it, but this is an illegal move in this stage, because even though the rook and the king see each other in this position, it can't go ahead and do it. Why? Because it is going through check, and that's the next term I wanted to talk about. In this position, if it's happened to do it, and the next move, the queen is in a position to take the king, and the game is over. And you don't want that. So this is technically not allowed. And you'll know, the computer will prevent you from doing it. You'll be like, why can't I castle? It's not making my king move. I'm not getting the option. Although I'm seeing there's this nice empty space. That's pretty annoying. But then again, remember how I said, look at this, the queen's vulnerable here. Your pawn's attacking it diagonally. Boom. There you go. Queen captured. Yeah, queen captured. So in this position, remember how I said, basically you look at how your pieces move, and if you have pieces, you have friendly pieces of your team, you're basically covering them, right? Bam, bam, bam. Like it would have it's covering your pawn. Your knight is covering your pawn, but your bishop isn't protecting your pawn. Bishop is being attacked. Bishop can attack this pawn, the enemy's pawn, if it wanted to. So that's how attack and defense works. So you got to keep that in mind, and slowly over time, you guys will, pick it up the more you guys play. So that's how castling works. I think I've covered all the move sets for all the pieces. The one thing I wanted to talk about real quick was the idea of the objective of game of chess. How to actually win the game of chess? Well, the objective is to capture this king. And what do I mean by capture? Well, if, say, for example, your knight was here and it's in this position, right? You see how the enemy knight has this option of going like this. In the next move, in this move right here, your king is said to be in check. And when this happens, usually, the other person will call out check, and the computer will kind of tell you, if you're playing online, that you're in check, meaning you have to respond to this threat. In the next move, you've lost the game if you don't respond to this check. Why? Because the knight can come over and actually take it. It doesn't do that, but it just basically means the game's over if you don't respond to it. How do you respond to a check? Well, you can either block the check. Say your queen was in the way. There you go. You've blocked, or I'm sorry, that's not how you block it. You could move in this case, you could move the knight's a pretty unique piece. But in this case, you could move the king out of the way of check. So it's not in any of the attacking squares that this knight can move to, right? This knight now can move here, or it could move here. But it's your king is not in danger because the knight doesn't attack it. So it's avoided check. You could remove the attacking piece in this case by, see how the queen can move diagonally, and in this case, bam, it can take the knight. The knight's undefended here, and you've removed the attacking piece. There you go. So that's another way to stop check. The other thing is blocking, and knight's probably not a good example. Let's go with one of these pieces here, the rook. This is known as you're blocking the rook's line of attack. So see how initially the rook was had a direct line of sight to your king. This is known as a check. You've moved your queen over one square and you've basically blocked its vision. And so now the rook is attacking your queen, but you've blocked your enemy team having a check on your king. So that's basically how you avoid check. And obviously this is a bad move because in the next move it can take your queen, and you don't want that. Remember how I said this is a very powerful piece, and you have to basically know what you're doing when you're playing the game with the queen. So you don't want to do that. But you could have blocked it with, say your rook was here, you could have blocked it with your own rook. And even if this rook took it, in the next move the king can actually move and take pieces just like any other piece. And bam, it can take your rook, and you've saved your king actually saved himself, which is pretty neat. So that's what I wanted to talk about real quick, about how to make checks. And eventually you'll get into a position where, let me try to arrange this board real quick to show you what I mean by the game being over. Okay, let's say, where's the queen at? Make it easier, okay? Make it easier. Bam. In this position right here, okay? In this position right here, this is known as an in-your-face checkmate. And that's how the game's ended. Because none of your pieces, as far as I can tell, let me make a quick scan. I don't think so. Nope. None of your pieces is protecting your king. None of your pieces this piece can only move diagonally. And this way, right? it can't do anything to this queen. Your white light squared bishop can't do anything either. Bam. It can't do anything to this rook, right? And if the king were to take this queen, it can't do that. Why? Because the rook's defending your queen, and then that's an illegal move. So in this situation, remember how the queen can move diagonally too? So it's covering these two squares as well. And later on, you'll find out that it's not just about defending your pieces, but it also is, the game of chess is also how to attack and defend squares. And that's, getting into advanced territory. In this situation, the knight is actually has, ownership of this square, or it can see this square as well. So if your piece was there, not only is it attacking it, in the future, say your piece moved here, it's a bad move because the knight is actually seeing the square. So it's probably a bad idea for you to move your pawn here, because on the next move, bam, the knight can take that pawn real easily. And you would have just lost a pawn for no reason. But in this situation, on its own, it's fine. So you got to keep that in mind. And, like I said, with practice, you'll kind of get to know how to play the game better. But hopefully this is giving you guys a good idea of how to play the game of chess. And I try to make it as comprehensive as I could. I don't know how long this video is, but hopefully I've answered a lot of questions that personally I had when I first started. And fun fact, I learned chess when I was really young, and I stopped playing for quite some time, and I just recently got back into it. And I basically had to kind of review myself how to play the game. And I really didn't find any videos out there that helped me at the time. But hopefully this video will prove useful to all those who are starting out their journey in chess. If for whatever reason I didn't cover anything, just let me know. Maybe I'll make a small short video covering that to the best of my ability. But in the meantime, hope you guys find this video helpful. Have a wonderful day, and I will see you on the next one.